Ahoy, and welcome to Titanic Talkline. I'm Alexia, and I'm excited this week to have, well, I've written down as Caldwell. Julie, what do you go by professionally? I'm sorry, I did not check this out.
I'm actually Julie Hedgepath Williams, and
Okay.
my great uncle was Albert Caldwell, who was a survivor of the Titanic, along with his wife and baby. And he was my kind of a surrogate grandfather to me. He's someone I knew well. He was
Mhm.
26 at the time, and he lived to be 91. So I heard the story from him over and over and over again. So, yeah, although my name is not Caldwell, I would definitely think of him as a grandfather figure to me.
I mean, I think that fits. I mean, it sounds like it was, but was that your Titanic story was, growing up with
Oh,
him as your, yeah.
yeah. Albert, Uncle Al, he was Uncle Al to me and to my mother and father. It was my mother. He was my mother's uncle, and my sisters. We all called him Uncle Al, even though I think both of his wives over time called him Albert. But nevertheless, Uncle Al to us was very, very dear, and he loved to talk about the Titanic. I've since heard many times from people, "Oh, my grandmother, my relative was so traumatized that we only found out on her deathbed that
Mhm.
she had been on the Titanic." And Uncle Al was not that way. He talked about it from 1912 on, and lived till 1977. I suppose the last time he spoke in public was 76. So he
Mhm.
loved to talk about it, and it was a real privilege at the time. I didn't know how rare that was. I knew even as a child that was a it was a real cool thing to have a great
Right.
the Titanic, but I didn't realize how rare it was for someone to speak about it in such detail and so happily.
Did he just talk about the survival, or did he talk about, the experience of being on the ship as a whole?
He talked a little about both. His story is much longer. Have written a book about him, biography, A Rare Titanic Family, and
Mhm.
that accounts for even starting in childhood for both he and his wife and their infant who was born, overseas, but all the way up. But what he mainly focused on, he would mention bits of his childhood to me just as something in fun.
Mhm.
But in the end, his main purpose was to speak about why they were in Siam, we say Thailand today, why they left and their passage through Europe and then onto the Titanic and then getting rescued. Now, there was a lot more to the story ultimately as I started to try to unravel it for the biography. And it
Mhm.
was kind of a surprise. It was good stuff. But, he had told a very extensive speech and gave it over and over again. And then over time, I was aware of how the Titanic had affected him after
Mhm.
the time because he spoke about it and he would refer to things like wanting his gold money back that he had left on board, things like that. They were told in the, I don't know, almost in that respect, being humorous. He always expected, he envisioned they would raise the Titanic. He knew they would find it, knew they would
Right.
find it. They'd raise it, bring it in, and he was walking on board to get his money back. He had left it in his cabin. Anyway, they didn't find it quite in his lifetime. It was very close. He almost made it, but that was his goal.
That's fair. I am convinced. I don't know where, but I once put $20 in the pocket of something and I still haven't found it. And I'm pretty sure that I still have whatever garment it is. I know that money is gone, but in my brain, I'm doing exactly what your Uncle Al did, which is going, I'm gonna get it one day. One day.
Exactly.
It's gone, man. Uh that's I find that really interesting because in the course of my doing this, ooh, I'm going to punch my microphone. In the course of my doing this podcast, I've sort of realized that there's quote unquote three Titanic eras. There is sinking to Discovery, then there's Discovery to Cameron film, and then there's post Cameron film.
That's probably right.
It, I don't say that to be dismissive of other things, but just I think that's more indicative of how pop culture has changed over the years. And I think it is very interesting, like you mentioned, that he was so close to the actual discovery. I wonder how that would have influenced him to have that technology of the time be able to confirm things like that. It did break in half to see those images, and he sounds like he would have been really fascinated by it.
Oh, he would have been. He was very interested in the Titanic, as I say, never shied away from talking about it. Part of that was because they were fleeing their jobs in Siam. Both he and his wife Sylvia had been missionaries in Siam, which of course we call Thailand today.
Hmm.
And they left. He just said that he always said the climate did not agree with my wife's health, which was correct. And they left. As it turns out, the story is much more intricate. They really were denied leaving. They were supposed to stay for 5 more years. Their boss tried to block their path. He finally reluctantly let them go. So in the end, the boss was kind of chasing them around the world. That's what I found out that he never talked about. It was very exciting.
Jeez.
Oh, it was awful when they got off the Carpathia. The agent of the boss was waiting to take her into custody. Somewhat, we'll never know because they did not do it, but they were not able to find her in the crowd. But
Was he married to Carmen Sandiego? My goodness.
kind of.
Oh wow, that's a lot.
Really exciting, and really they were just upset that the boss and their mission boss in Siam was upset that Sylvia had said she was sick, and she was. One of their friends left a diary, and and of course Sylvia was pregnant. I think that was the whole problem. Sylvia had baby Alden over in Siam, and it was obvious from the diary of her friend that she was having a really hard pregnancy. That every time the friend mentioned her, Mrs. C is sick. She's going to have to go to the infirmary. She'll have to go home. I had to take off work today to take care of Mrs. C.
Oof.
It was a pretty big deal. And continually mentioning things like that. And I believe the boss thought, so you had a hard pregnancy. What else is new? And he thought, well, this is something that happens to women. It will be over with soon. She'll have a baby. But in the end, their doctor, because she had trouble recovering from childbirth, their doctor diagnosed that she had to go home because otherwise she would lose her mind. It was a time. And so they went crazy, begging to go home, petitioning, and they finally got permission to go. And as soon as they had left, the boss changed his mind and he cabled ahead to New York to headquarters. And he said, hey, Caldwells are on their way home. When they arrive in New York, have Mrs. Caldwell examined by some of our doctors before you settle their account. Now, they were traveling under the credit of the church, Presbyterian Church, and they didn't have a credit card like we have today.
Right.
But essentially, they had a letter of credit and the church was to pay for the voyage. And if she were found healthy, according to that direction from their boss, if she were found healthy, then either they would have to go back to Siam and finish their 5 more years of service, or the church would refuse to pay and they would have to pay for their trip home. And that was just really super expensive. They had saved $100 from their salary, which they had converted into gold coins quite by accident. Back then, people carried gold coins. It was a legal tender in the U.S. And that's what's at the bottom of the Atlantic right now. There's $100. Now, doing a conversion on that, it's roughly worth $3,000 today. And that would have bought them roughly only the passage across the Atlantic. So they would have still had a lot of money to pay for getting from Thailand to Southampton and then from New York to Illinois, where they were going. And so they were very glad when in the end the church did not make them pay. It would have been terrible PR for the church making Titanic pay. I can't imagine that they would have succeeded in that. But anyway, it was quite a cat and mouse game around the globe as the boss was waiting for them. And it was pretty exciting. Anyway, I can't remember what your original question was, but I'm sure you can let me know.
Good news. I've also forgotten the original question. Half the reason I met Julie at the Titanic convention this year, and not to say that other speeches were not good, but yours was my favorite because you talk like me, where you're like, I'm just going to go till someone tells me to stop. And then someone does. And I'm like, bye. That's it.
Well, I give that speech all over the place and I love giving it. And I actually shortened it a little bit because they only gave me 45 minutes. So I was bummed about that. It should be for an hour, but it's a great story. And I love telling it as kind of a tribute to Uncle Al. He was so dear to us. And, and I have it, worked out to tell the entire story from what he told, then as a break in the middle, what we found out. Because when Uncle Al passed away in 1977, among his effects that came to my mom was a photograph of them on the deck of the Titanic, which we didn't remember. We had never seen. He didn't remember he had. And this has been confirmed many times over. But that launched us into thinking there was more to the story than we knew. Where was this photograph? Who took the photograph? How did they get it? Because he had a camera down with the ship, that sort of thing. And it was quite an unraveling of the huge story that was Uncle Al was absolutely accurate in telling his story of the sinking and the trip on the Titanic, the sinking and the whole bit. Everything was accurate, but there were parts that he never told that I found by that process.
I mean, I think that one of the common threads that I hear when I talk to people who are relatives of Titanic survivors is that there's always you learn a couple things posthumously. And it's like, it's not necessarily because these people were like, ooh, I have to keep my secrets. Shh, no, no, no. It's just there may have been some parts that people either intentionally or unintentionally just try to forget.
I think that's quite possible because in a way, I thought maybe Uncle Al was concealing the fact that they were being pursued by their boss. And we found great evidence of that. But I thought also it may be that he was not aware of it because in the end, what the boss was waiting with an ambulance to take Sylvia directly to Presbyterian Hospital for an examination. And I knew from that letter in the church archives that they were not going to pay for their passage home if she were found healthy. It was okay. A shocker. But they may have never known that. It's possible that they were not told that they were simply picked up by a friend from Missouri who happened to be there, an official of the college they went to. And so this friend picked them up and whisked them away to a hotel that was accepting Titanic survivors and putting them up for free.
Of course.
And it is possible that none of them ever knew. However, this friend was an official of their college, and his brother was on the board of foreign missions, and he knew the brother would have known about this conflict. And I'm not beyond thinking that the brother told his brother, who was visiting a town for a convention, pick them up and get them out of the way so that they don't have to pay their passage. So I think maybe he did know, maybe the friend picking them up knew about it and the Caldwells didn't. Or maybe the Caldwells did and Uncle Al kept it a secret, or maybe he'd forgotten over the years. I do have evidence that he forgot things over the years. Everything he told in the Titanic story was accurate, which I can tell you any of that if you like. Mm-hmm. But like I remember in 1912, or I found in 1912 in the press, he said the ship definitively broke in half.
Right.
Whereas by the time he was 90 years old, I remember we gave him the book, Raise the Titanic for Christmas, and that one has the Titanic going down whole. And that was a going theory of the time. And he had read all the going theories. And I think he had just forgotten what he had seen or had figured, well, it was a long time ago. Maybe I didn't see it correctly. Yeah. So by the end of his life, he was saying it went down whole. So you see things like that I know at one point he said it one way and the other point he said it the other. But all in all, his own story, was always accurate and borne out by history. So I guess he was technical tales to someone else.
I'd like to encourage people to pick up your book if they haven't, but for those who weren't able to, go to the convention and maybe aren't, would you like to tell, maybe an abbreviated version of your talk?
I would love to. Okay, so Uncle Al and Sylvia met in Park University now, and got married a few months after graduation, left that very day to go to Siam to become missionaries. Because think about it, they graduated in 1909. What's Sylvia going to do for a career? This was a hard thing for young women in college at the time.
And where is Park College, by the way? I'm sorry.
It's very near Kansas City, very close to Kansas City.
Thank you. I don't know anything about geography.
So she wanted to go to missionary work, and they went. And the very first thing that happened to them was that she was very seasick on the way over, and she kind of and that turned out to be a theme actually that brought them to the Titanic ultimately. So they had a short time enjoying Siam as co-teachers at the Bangkok, what's now called Bangkok Christian College. It's still there. It was always a K-12 school for boys, even though it was called a college. But then she became pregnant with Alden, their son, and apparently it was a difficult pregnancy. And that's when her health problems began to appear, and she was diagnosed, as I said earlier, that she should go home.
Right.
Excuse me. And so they got permission to go after much pleading, as I found out. Now, Uncle Al never told that. They had to beg and petition and carry on, but finally they got permission. And so they left on the Derflinger from Singapore, and the Derflinger made her seasick every single day, the whole time they were on the Indian Ocean. So And apparently she's very seasick through the Suez Canal.
Oh, great.
When we got to Naples, they were anticipating going to a spa for the condition that she had, the sickness that she had.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we don't recognize as a sickness. They would probably say it was fibromyalgia or something like that today.
Okay.
But nevertheless, at the time, it was called neurasthenia, and we don't have that diagnosis anymore.
I
And
will admit that I've never heard of that, and I do have fibromyalgia.
so she was going to go to a spa for 3 weeks. We do know that. And then suddenly they didn't go for 3 weeks. Well, their grandson recalled that she was very afraid of cholera. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, Naples was riddled with cholera, and they arrived.
Ooh.
And so apparently they said, you know what, we can't stay here. It's not safe. Cholera, dangerous, yuck, you know.
Yes.
So
No, thank you.
apparently agreed they would take the first ship they saw leaving for the United States, because this part he always told. So they saw a ship in the harbor in Naples flying the American flag, which meant it was leaving for America that day. So he
Okay.
asked the sailor, hey, what ship is that? And he said, that's the Carpathia leaving for New York today. And they actually stood in line to get tickets on the Carpathia, but they changed their mind. And I always thought, what, we never thought to ask why they changed their mind.
Yeah, that's my question. Why?
Exactly. But when I found out about the seasickness, and I found out her comment that she'd been seasick every single day on the Derflinger, I had this light bulb moment. I thought, how big was the Derflinger? And it was the exact same dimensions as the Carpathia. And so she was looking at a couple more weeks of seasickness without even
that size.
Yeah. And so at that point, they decided to go in and get a hotel room. She was exhausted from seasickness.
Sure.
And while they're in the hotel, they saw an ad for the Titanic, which is the largest ship in the world. And Uncle Al said, there, that's the ship we're taking. Well, the larger the ship, the less the seasickness. So they had to make their way to the Titanic, which was sailing in 3 weeks. That was about the time they had intended to stay at the spa. So they went on an impromptu trip through Europe. Oddly enough, I discovered at the time that was considered a poor man's trip. Isn't that fun? Considered an economical thing to do. Well, anyway, they trained through Europe and, went to various parts of Italy and Paris, and they went across to London. And they checked in at the hotel that we found out was called the Banshee. Bansha, not Banshee.
Oh,
Banshee.
I was going to say, I would love to stay at the Banshee.
Shot it was. And anyway, they went in the next day to get tickets on the Titanic, and I would know they would have. I was traveling with a letter of credit. They probably had to go to the actual headquarters rather than just buy one from a ticket salesperson in Naples. So they went in, and Uncle Al said, we want a second class passage on the Titanic, and he said, the clerk said, sorry, sold out. And as my uncle always put it, I must have looked like a very disappointed boy, because the clerk said, oh, sir, every day there's a cancellation. If you come in tomorrow, you can have the first cancellation that comes in. So he got up early the next morning, went into the White Star, nervous and sweating. I remember he always said he was sort of trying to work out how they would get home if this didn't work out. But around noon, a call came in, and it was a cancellation in second class, exactly what they wanted. So they got it. And as they were on the boat train to Southampton from London, everyone was talking about how lucky they were to be sailing on the world's newest, largest, and most luxurious ocean liner, and unsinkable. Now, it was clear that Caldwells had not heard this term. This was not why they were taking it. They were taking it for seasickness sake, right?
Right. Practical reasons.
They were kind of skeptical, especially Sylvia. She was so skeptical that when they got on board, the baggage handler took their travel trunk to go to their cabin. Right. And she said, is this ship really non-sinkable? And he answered her with the most famous line ever spoken about the Titanic. I bet you know what it is. Do
God
you?
himself couldn't sink this ship?
That's what he said to her. And that famous line is just used in every account of the Titanic that's fictitious. But it was really said to Sylvia Caldwell, and that's pretty cool. So Uncle Al remembered it as, here's a ship God Almighty cannot sink. But it was a similar, remembrance of it.
I feel like maybe we shouldn't say things like that.
It was just a deckhand. That's what's so funny. People say, oh, the Titanic was struck down because their makers said this. Now, clearly he had heard it and other people had heard it. And I don't, but it's funny to me that famous line came from a deckhand. Sure. Anyway, so they did love the ship. They said it was absolutely wonderful. It was so big and so stable. Sylvia was not seasick. It worked.
Hey.
It was the first time she'd ever been on a ship and not been seasick.
Poor
And
thing.
I know, and it was just a gorgeous voyage. And as Uncle Al would put it, the tables were piled high with all the luxuries and delicacies one could ever want. And
Yeah.
because she was not seasick, Sylvia could eat them. That was even better.
Oh, yes, that's the. I was gonna say, like, that must be super disappointing to have everyone talk about how good the food is, and you be like, "That's great. I can't give anything down."
Exactly. And she had had severe trouble with that. And it really did govern their desire to go on the Titanic. Anyway, so of course, on the night of April 14th, there in the evening, I guess might be a more accurate timing, they went to the church service in the second class dining saloon. And it was mainly a hymn sing, but the volunteer pastor gave a short sort of homily sermon on for those in peril on the sea, based on the old naval hymn, "Eternal Father, strong to save," whose line ends with, "Oh, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea." Of course, they had no idea they were the ones in peril. It was meant to be a metaphor. And anyway, it was very cold. They noticed that, and they normally took Alden out for a spin on deck, but it was too cold, so they went to bed to stay warm. And Uncle Al went to sleep on the lovely vibrating, vibrated with the ship's movement, the bed, very comfortable, he said. And Sylvia was sharing the bottom bunk with a baby. And it's very clear he'd been fussy that day, as we came to find out. But anyway, so I don't know how she got any sleep. I'll be honest. Boy,
Oh.
she was kind of lying awake or dozing lightly when the ship hit the iceberg, and she felt it shudder. She always described it as like a large dog shaking a small kitten in its mouth, which is pretty firm. But nevertheless, she woke Uncle Al up, and he jumped up and ran out, found a sailor, and said, "Why have we stopped?" Because the ship had come to a halt. And he said, "Meh, just hit a little iceberg. No harm done, I guess. Go back to bed."
Oh, no
So
big deal. Don't worry about it. Too late. I'm worried.
he was actually not. He climbed back in bed, and he said it was hard to fall asleep without the vibrating bed, but he finally did.
Oof.
But then they were shocked awake by someone pounding on the door, calling them out on deck. So they went to get their baby in his little coat and little hat, which were in the travel trunk. And they couldn't find the keys anywhere. I mean, they looked and looked and looked, but where do we put them? And finally, they remembered earlier that day they had given the baby the keys to play with, which is why we realized the baby was fussy all day. Because what else do you do with a fussy baby?
Right.
Give him a toy, and that was the toy. And he apparently had thrown them away. I mean, the baby was just 10 months old.
No.
So they never found the keys. So they had to leave his coat and hat in the trunk and wrap him in a blanket. And they also had to leave their $100 and American gold coins, their life savings, in the cabin, which is what Uncle Al wanted back all his life. And anyway, they went out on the deck, and Sylvia said they had a lovely time talking with people. She was very outgoing and social, and it was fun talking to people they would have never met. It was very cold. And finally, a sailor said, "Hey, maybe you all want to get out of the wind." They noticed the baby was cold. And so a bunch of people went down several flights of stairs to be loaded onto a lifeboat from a gangway. Now, the Caldwells had noticed the lifeboats being loaded, and they were utterly shocked because everyone knew the Titanic was not going to sink. In fact, Uncle Al had gone back to the cabin to get another blanket for the baby, probably to look for the keys again. But
one more try.
He stepped through and then back through a watertight door that was still open. And he always said, "Oh, thank goodness the captain didn't push the button to close the watertight doors while I was back there."
Woo!
Well, the rumor was not quite accurate, that the captain could push a button on the bridge and lower all the watertight doors, and that's what made the Titanic unsinkable. In reality, that he only could lower the engine room doors, which he had done. But Uncle Al took that to mean the captain didn't think the ship was in that much danger because the watertight doors had not been lowered. So it was just a mistaken impression on his part.
Sure.
Anyway, so they didn't think it was worth Sylvia getting off, because here she was, had neurasthenia, which meant her arms were weak. How was she going to row a boat and hold a baby? That was almost ludicrous.
And I hope that no one expected her to actually do both.
Well, they're probably putting women and children off. What are they doing?
That's fair.
So they decided there was no need to get off. But anyway, they went down into the this lower deck, and nobody ever came to let them on a lifeboat. So they climbed back up, And I didn't even tell this in the talk the other day, but the only place that they were stopped is as they were climbing up from third class space to second class space on a very steep she called it a ladder. It was a cruise stairs. You
Mm-hmm.
can see it on models of the Titanic. It is pretty steep, but it was meant to be stairs,
Right.
and it was meant to be off limits to the passengers. But way, a steward tried to stop Uncle Al and said no more men at this point, and then a woman in their party came around behind him and said, "Can't this gentleman go to carry his own child? You know, there's no other woman behind me." And at that
Right.
point, an officer overruled the steward and let Uncle Al go. And
Mm-hmm.
so they made their way up to the lifeboat deck, which involved Sylvia being pulled up on a swing because she couldn't climb; she didn't have the strength.
Right.
And
Yikes.
Uncle Al had to climb a ladder. This was a crew ladder by then. He had to climb a ladder holding the baby in the other hand. He was very athletic. Anyway, they got up to the deck and they were still not totally convinced. But just then, a group of stokers came by. Now, here's what a blessing. Uncle Al had a camera. He had been all over the Titanic taking photographs. Wish we still had those photographs. But
Mm.
one of the photographs that he took was of the stokers in the engine room. And he had then had the idea for a 1912 version of a selfie. He had said, "Can I shovel the coal into the furnace and you take my picture?" And so the guy said, "Sure." And they exchanged camera and advice on how to look professional. And they also exchanged names.
Mm-hmm.
So on this crucial moment, as they're standing up by the boat deck, here came one of those stokers, a bunch of stokers, but one of them recognized him and called him by name. He said, "Mr. Caldwell, if you value your life, get off this ship. I've been and the hold is filling up with water, and this ship will go down." Well,
Ugh.
at that point, he took that seriously, and that's why at that moment, Lifeboat 13 was going by, and the stokers ran and stopped it and got on, and the Caldwells dropped all their objections and they followed. They were the last three on board. So that was how they were convinced to get on. It
Good.
was until they, of course, as we all know from the James Cameron movie, Lifeboat 13 had all sorts of problems. It didn't go down evenly. It was one that pitched forward and back, and people were screaming and hanging on for dear life. And when they got to the
Mm.
line, they were in front of a condenser pump throwing water out of the Titanic, and they were all drenched. And Uncle Al said he had to cover the baby, lean over the baby to keep him out of the wind, as he recalled it. But I know it was to keep him out of the water too. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so they were kind of drenched, and so the men hastily untied the oars to use them to propel the 13 out of the water, out of the way of the pump water.
Right.
And I put them underneath 15, but no matter, all they had to do was pull a lever to release 13 from the side of the big ship. But no, the lever was gummed up with shiny red paint. Oh, I still remember Uncle Al telling me that when I was about 12, and I had not realized the Titanic was in color because it was before
Ugh.
the James Cameron movie. It was so funny. I remember with a shock. Of course, it was in color. What? How stupid are you? But anyway, so this paint had pulled in the mechanism and they were stuck, and the women were screaming to stop lowering the boat above. And finally the boat above got so close they could pound on the bottom, and mercifully that boat got the message. And Sylvia said a person from the boat above threw a knife down, and that's what they cut themselves free with.
Oh, good.
And they rowed away half a mile, and that was the first time they realized the Titanic was in trouble. And by
Oof.
then it had maybe, I think, 20 more minutes. I mean, they literally they could not see any trouble. And so it's not a surprise to me that a lot of people could not perceive danger aboard. And they had the horrible situation of watching it go down. And it did break in half, he said, and momentarily the stern looked like it might float, but then it too went down, as he said, with a gentle swish. She was
Mm.
gone. That's how he described it. And then the cries started, everyone who had been thrown into the water. And as Sylvia said, the cries were the weirdest, most appalling, most heartrending noise ever mortal might hear. One
Mm.
man on the boat said, "It's just people singing." And her response to that was, "But who could be deceived?"
Yeah,
And
seriously.
I asked Uncle Al about that when he was 90, because I had not remembered him speaking about it. And he was always full of smiles. He just was a very happy person. And
Mm-hmm.
at the time the smile went away and his face just turned gray. And he said, "You just have to forget the screams or you'd go crazy."
I
And
can
even
only
as a
imagine.
16-year-old, I realized he had been actively forgetting the screams all those years.
Yeah.
So anyway, there they were stuck on the North Atlantic, not sure if they were going to be picked up or not. And they kept scanning the horizon looking for a light. All they could see were
Yes.
light boats. finally, a young man on the boat said, "I think I see a real ship on the horizon." And Uncle Al couldn't see it, neither could Sylvia. And
Mm.
they were pretty young. They were in their late 20s, but they were, discouraged. They didn't dare hope. But after another hour, they could see there was a ship coming. And indeed, when dawn broke, it was right there. And it was the Carpathia.
Mm.
They had turned down in Naples for being too small. And now it looked very large to them from the waterline where they were.
Yes, large, inviting, and appealing, I'm sure.
And they were very grateful to be on her. And the Carpathia's crew pulled the baby up in a sack and pulled Sylvia up in a swing, and Uncle Al had to climb the ladder. And they were reunited, and they began to realize how much loss there had been and how fortunate they were to all three still be together. And Uncle Al was on the side of the Titanic that allowed men off. A lot of people don't realize there was such a side. One side allowed men and the other side did not. So they were a little bit taken aback with how many were lost, and well, maybe a lot taken aback. They're just horrified. And
Sure.
anyway, the Carpathia decided to turn around and go back to New York. And that was where their friend picked them up, the official from their college in Missouri, and they managed to miss the ambulance waiting for Sylvia to have her health test before they would be paid back. So they kind of dodged that bullet.
Good for them. Able to somehow get around that.
Yeah, which they may or may not have known about. I kind of suspect they did and just never talked about it so that over time it became not part of the story,
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just such an incredible story. And a not irony, but a very interesting piece of irony as you were saying, like, oh no, this ship that we didn't no, let's not take that one. That's the one that suddenly decides to come to your not decides, but that's the one that comes to the rescue.
Yeah, it really was. They were really amazed. It was on her way. They said she was on her way to Gibraltar, which was true, but her further stop would have been in Naples, where they had seen it the first time.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of a bit of irony. There was an exhibit on the Carpathia somewhere, I think maybe at the Belfast Museum in Ireland, and they asked if anybody had any good Carpathia stories. So I sent that one in, and a friend who was able to go said she saw it. They had published it there. It was kind of cool that they thought about
Yeah,
taking Carpathia.
I think that is neat. I feel as though the one part of the story that is often a little bit left out is maybe the Carpathia itself. It was pretty important in the whole Titanic thing.
Very much so. Every year on the anniversary of the Carpathia being sunk in World War One, somebody will post a picture of her going down, which they did take. Someone took, and I always write, "Thank you, Carpathia. You were a good ship." Because it meant a lot to us as Uncle
Mm-hmm.
Al's family that he lived to tell the story.
Yeah. I know that the second part of your talk is, as you said, things that you found out. That was a very abridged version of, I think, his story. Do you have a sort of abridged version of like the post?
I can make one. Yeah, so when he died on March 10th, 1977,
Mm-hmm.
among the things that came to my mother, who was one of his heirs, he had two sons and they were his heirs. And then his second wife, Jenny, had three nieces and nephews, and they were her heirs. And so everything went to these five people. And my mom went up. It's a little interesting personal family history. My grandmother, Uncle Al's sister-in-law, died on the same day, just by coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
And mother was, of course, grieving her mother who had been lost, but they needed to go break up Uncle Al's apartment very quickly because they didn't want to continue paying rent on an empty apartment, as Aunt Jenny, his second wife, moved to a nursing home at that point.
Sure.
And so she went up there in her grief and didn't realize they were taking furniture and stuff out. She kind of missed that memo. And so she wound up all the paper goods. So in the end, we wound up with this wonderful photograph.
Mm-hmm.
We had to do a lot of research to find out that it was definitely the Titanic, and it's been authenticated
Wow.
many times over. So there they are on the Titanic, and wow, how did that get taken? I thought we'd never know that. And then I began to realize a lot of stuff we had never asked, like, why did they not take the Carpathia? Was Sylvia really sick? Because we always heard rumors that she wasn't really sick, and all this kind of stuff. And really, I needed to, at that point, at the point of trying to write the book many years later, I tried to get to know Sylvia better, because Sylvia and Uncle Al divorced in 1930, and in
Mm-hmm.
1936 he married my great aunt. So we knew him and his second wife, but we did not know her.
Sure.
And so, trying to look up her story, that's when I began to find out about her sickness and the fact that they were under suspicion because of her sickness, and that I went to the Presbyterian Archives and told my husband, guess what, honey? We're going to Philadelphia on vacation. So we took our two sons to Philadelphia so that I could go to the archives. And I looked up why they had resigned, and there was absolutely no information on why they resigned. That was so interesting to me. It just said resigned. And so over time, I had to order the minutes of the Siam mission, and they'll tell you that they when they filmed these back in the 1950s, they were just done willy nilly. There's no real rhyme or reason to it, and they just warn you at that point. Good luck. And so, as it turns out, oh, this really struck me too. We call everything the minutes of a meeting, and I just think they're the notes of the minute meeting. Well, back in that day, or at least in that mission, each little piece of information was on one index card, and that was 1 minute. So you had to go through all these cards on microfilm. And I finally found the Sylvia's doctor's diagnosis, and also found their friends who had also been scrapping it up with the mission, trying to leave early. Mm-hmm. And his names were Connie Bear, and I thought that was an unusual enough name. And I discovered, that he taught later at the University of Iowa, while my great uncle was a principal in the same town, school principal. Anyway, that their name Connie Bear prompted their grandson to say, I bet we could find their descendants. Why didn't I think of that? But he did. Yes, and he found their granddaughter, and she had their diary. So we were able to prove that Sylvia definitely was sick. Now, she was sick while being pregnant. As I said, that was where the difficulty came in. The male boss saying, well, women are sick when they're pregnant. What else is new? And Sylvia saying, this is not to me, even though she was her first pregnancy, but she was halfway around the world. I'd have been afraid too.
Same.
So I started, finding out her illness and the need for them to travel. And then I found out about her seasickness. That way she wrote to her alumni magazine that she was seasick every single day. And, you just don't normally write to your alumni magazine about seasickness. You usually write about your or something like that, your job, your home. But anyway, your dog, whatever. But she was writing about seasickness. So, it was really bad.
And, that's consuming your entire brain.
Right, exactly. And also found among Uncle Al's things, one of the great treasures my mom wound up with was a booklet called Women of the Titanic Disaster that Sylvia wrote in 1912, just a few months after, if not right after. And it was published by a company out in Missouri. And as far as we could tell, there are only 2 copies left in the world. One in the state archives and one in my safe place where I keep it. And it turned out that ultimately Sylvia was an employee of State Farm, and she was the secretary to the boss, and eventually she married the boss, and that's why they came to have this document in their archives. But as far as I know, there's not another copy of it. But in researching that copy, I discovered that was her topic. She was supposed to speak on Women of the Titanic on the Chautauqua circuit right after they got out of the Carpathia. They didn't have a job anymore. They had lost their jobs because they had quit.
Right.
And humorously to me, and interestingly, the press did not understand that. They thought they were on their furlough, as they called it, kind of a sabbatical. And not. They had actually left under some fire and some cloud of suspicion, and so they just didn't bother to correct that. And every time, as I discovered in the press, that they were expected to speak, Uncle Al would speak, but Sylvia would not. And she would always be given, like he was telling me, sorry, my wife couldn't speak because she had nervous prostration and things like that.
Okay.
Said about women in that era. Well, I don't really believe she had nervous prostration about speaking, because she had won awards for speaking in college, and she spent her time as a hobbyist on stage. That she was a community theater actor. So I don't think she had stage fright. I think she was nervous about possibly being found out or being accused of being not sick. And I did notice that almost every place she was expected to speak, if not every one that we know she was expected to speak, had a religious connection. And so that if people thought, well, this woman was a missionary, and they got wind of the fact that she was fleeing for her health, and now she looked really healthy. They might have been afraid they'd be called to go back, so she conveniently bowed out. But one of the topic she was supposed to speak about was women of the Titanic disaster,
Mm-hmm.
and apparently in Oregon, Missouri, they commented that she had written this book, and she was selling it by subscription, so please buy it. And I noticed that the publisher of it in St. Joseph, Missouri, I discovered that he was the proprietor of the Chautauqua there, so that he was probably the one who published it for her. I mean, he was
Mm-hmm.
probably, she was supposed to speak at that Chautauqua and bowed out as well. So that in the end, they got the story out of her as a piece of paper. And it was interesting. It was a lot of eavesdropping on women in the Carpathia. She was listening to them talking about their experience now of what were they going to do next. And it was really
Mm-hmm.
touching. One of them turned to her and said, "I'm not saying this to you because you're an American, but I'd rather be going to America in this condition than any other country in the world, because they were going penniless. They literally just had the nightgowns that they were wearing when they got off the ship. They
Wow.
hadn't spent, and in that era, a lot of women were not educated to have a career.
Right.
Many would find something that they could be paid for, but it was a big life change and tragic for them. And so they were, a lot of them had complimentary things to say. Another one commented, "Never mind, I've never met an American without a big heart. They will take big," and that was one of those things. I'm sure she was hearing the most complimentary comments,
Sure.
but it moved her to write about them, and that's what the book is filled with, is what the women were saying on the Carpathia.
Mm-hmm.
And that was pretty, I don't know, revelatory to me. I liked her eavesdropping, and it was really interesting to hear.
I mean, sometimes it's not necessarily that it's eavesdropping, but sometimes it's just being able to overhear about the impacts of things that you were involved in.
Yeah.
That's really, number one, thank you for talking at the convention. And number two, thank you for sharing your story here. Um, the one thing that I've learned via doing this show is that everyone's personal story matters for the continuing of the legacy of the Titanic, because there was so many people from different walks of life that were a part of this. It's important to learn about the stories of people like Albert that, maybe weren't hit by the mainstream.
Right. I agree. Thank you. Yeah, because I know everybody, knows Molly Brown, and she's an interesting character. No
Sure.
denial. Everybody knows about John Jacob Astor and his wife, and they are interesting, and they were the celebrities of their day,
Mm-hmm.
the Taylor Swift of their day. Everybody followed what they. But people like Uncle Al were not followed. He was just a school teacher, and his wife was also a school teacher, and they were ordinary people. Now there were second class instead of third class on the Titanic's roster, mainly because the church would pay that much money for them to cross. But
Mm-hmm.
they were just ordinary people, middle class people, trying to get home. And I think their story is fascinating. Plus, I also love that, I know this story personally from Uncle Al himself, and that often when the more famous people, you get a several degrees removed story, because they were already famous in the media, and people kind of had a picture of them that if they knew the
Mm-hmm.
person might not quite be accurate. You know what I mean? I'm not saying I don't know, because I've not made a study, but I know that when you get this celebrity aura around you, that the story becomes removed into the celebrity field. Whereas a
Mm-hmm.
person like Lau, who wasn't a celebrity,
Right.
his more immediate and more, I think, probably in most cases true to what happened, or true to what he was. And so I love that aspect of it.
Yeah, I also just think that no matter who you are, a story is important. Titanic didn't have six people on it. It had, and a small society carried in it. It's a
Yes, it
lot of,
did. That's,
yeah, it's a lot of stories and a lot of hopes and dreams and fears.
yeah, exactly. That was a good description of it.
When did you decide that you, like, I'm getting to the end of my time with you, but when did you decide that you wanted to actually put this down into a book? Because writing a book it's not just like a thing you wake up and do for a few hours. It's a big effort.
Well, it's hilarious is that when Uncle Al told me the story, and I remember it distinctly from the time I was 12. years old on, although I remember knowing it ahead of time and being afraid of the story. When I was a little girl, we were watching a movie on TV about the Titanic, and my mother turned to me in the death voice, I call it, when somebody had died, she said, Julie. And I thought, oh no, what does that mean? Your uncle was on that ship, and that freaked me out, scared me. But I was just a little kid. I was in about fourth grade at that time. But when I was 12, we moved to near Uncle Al, and we got to see him frequently. And he probably had always told me the story, but at that point, I started to really, every time I see him, say, tell me this story. I recognize its importance. He influenced me to be a history major in college that way. I was so excited. Anyway, so I had always loved his story, and I retold it. He passed away moments before I set off for college. I mean, maybe a few months before. And I've had several college friends tell me, oh, gosh, you pinned me to the wall and told me his story back in college. And I, did I? It's kind of funny. So I've always retold his story, and I've loved it. But I corresponded with Walter Lord, the famous author of the Titanic book, A Night to Remember, and told Caldwell's story. And he said, yes, that's the stories he told it to me. And I continued to correspond with Walter Lord a little bit as I found record. I'd saved his letters. Do I remember it all that clearly? Well, no, because one of the things I sent him was that my second little boy, I named Alden. We named Alden for Alden Caldwell of the Titanic. And I had a notation from Walter Lord saying, congratulations on your Alden. Do I remember writing that? I had a toddler little boy and an infant little boy. I don't remember writing. Thank goodness I had the piece of paper, that young motherhood time. It was kind of a blitz. But anyway, I said to him in that letter, someday I want to write a biography of Uncle Al. And I laugh now at how, intense young motherhood is. And I don't remember saying that, but it came to me in the most unusual way. I wrote a book about the Wright brothers. I live in Alabama, and I discovered the Wright brothers had spent a really interesting semester in Alabama running a flying school in 1910. Know that, even though I'd grown up in Dayton, where the Wright brothers are from. So I wrote a book about that. And every time I write a book or anything important, I take it around and get people who contributed to it to sign it. It's my copy of the signed book. So one of my blurbers on the back was a mentor to me, and I took it to him, and I had him sign it. And he's, too bad you didn't think to write about the Titanic. Didn't you have a relative on it? And I thought, ugh. Apparently I told him the story too. So I contacted my publisher and said, hey, I have another book for you for the 100th anniversary of the Titanic. And so that was February, and they wrote back, if you can have it by October, we can do it. Get it out anniversary. And by golly, it was the most fun summer I ever spent, working night and day on that. And anyway, it was great. And by then the boys were a little bit older, so that I had kind of a little bit of breathing room.
Yeah.
So I believe my own son Alden, by then, who had been an infant before, is now 14. So my boys are kind of self-sufficient by then. They were in high school or about to be in high school. So if I'm remembering correctly, anyway, so it turned out to be, a very fun, intense summer of working on that book, which I thought I already knew. I told my publisher, I know this story like the back of my hand, but then I realized, well, I didn't know Sylvia's story. And that's when I began to really do a lot of research and discover that they were fleeing against their boss's will, and that they were, that there was a person waiting for them to pick them up, and the friend from Missouri whisked them out of the way of the person waiting for them. It was pretty exciting. It was an exciting summer.
That sounds exciting. And I mean, that's already a lot of work. And I know that you do this talk a lot, but do you have any upcoming plans for like other Titanic related stuff? Are you going to more events?
Well, I go to the Titanic Con mostly every year. I've been to it since it started. It's the year I had COVID. I decided I better not go at that point. Didn't have a bad case, but I didn't want to spread it. So I
appreciate it. That was my first year, and I'm immunocompromised. So thank you. I'm sad I didn't get to meet you that first year.
There you go. Yeah. So I go to that generally every year.
Yay.
And I get asked about the Titanic, speaking about the Titanic a lot. I speak in, ladies' garden clubs, historic groups, that sort of thing. So, people ask and I speak about it. And it's one of my more popular, I speak about all my books, but it's one of my more popular subjects. Sure. And so when anybody asks, I find a way to get there, or we work out a way. And so that's my main goal right now. I don't have any particular things in the works about Titanic at the moment, but I'm always spreading the word.
Well, I hope that you're planning on coming to next year's convention. It's gonna be back in Tennessee, I imagine.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of I don't know if it is or not, but I heard him say that a lot of the stars had to bow out and were begging to come back. Bowing out because of the actor strike,
Right.
and they were saying come back another year. So my thought was, well, it might be back in Las Vegas. I don't know. Yeah, probably back in Tennessee, but I don't know. I'm not the one to ask. Either way, my general plan would be to come. Unfortunately, it comes very close on the heels of me starting school, and
Mm.
sometimes that's a little bit of a worry. And but last year it worked out, so there you go.
Yeah. I hope it works out again this year because yeah, my plan is to go again. I don't dislike Vegas, but it's such a busy and chaotic city.
It is kind of chaotic, isn't it?
Yeah, there's nowhere you can go for some quiet. You can go places for loud, and you can go places for more loud.
Good description.
It's really all that it is. It's like, wow, where can you go for a quiet? Nowhere. You have to leave the city. Okay, understood. That was my one downside. At least in a Pigeon Forge, you could find quiet pretty easily.
That's true.
Well, Julie, thank you so much for coming on my show and for telling your Uncle Al's story and for talking about your book. For the people who have not read it, could you tell us the title one more time?
Yes, it's called A Rare Titanic Family. And it's rare because it was rare for a family to survive intact. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's the
That's
story of my uncle and his family, a rare Titanic family.
well, that's really incredible. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thanks so much. It's fun to see you here
Yeah, you too. And
on Zoom. And it's very fun to have made your acquaintance. This is great.
you too. And I'm sure I'll see you again in the future. So,
That's
yeah.
the plan.
All right. Well, thank you all listeners, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Okay. Bye bye.